The winter of 1995 is a season the small town of Fallow Pines, Maine won't soon forget. And I, David Owen, remember it most of all. Perhaps more than I'd like. I'd been living there with my wife, Claire, and our young daughter, Maddie, for nearly 2 years by then. Fallow Pines was the kind of town where people didn't bother with keys in their doors, and where neighbors helped each other build decks or shovel snow without being asked. It felt safe, at least it did until December 10th, the night Helen McCarthy went missing. Helen was the town's mail carrier, known by just about everyone. She was warm, friendly, and well-liked. Every morning, she waved to passers-by as she loaded her little white truck with letters and parcels, and every afternoon, she returned to the station, her hair mussed from the wind and a bright smile on her face. But that night, she didn't come back. No one saw her after she delivered her last route, and by morning, her truck was found abandoned by the river, headlights still on, casting a lonely glow into the dark. The police were called, of course, but they found little more than footprints leading from her truck to the water's edge. The river was swift that time of year, its icy currents strong enough to pull even the sturdiest swimmer under. It didn't take long before they gave up, chalking her disappearance up to a tragic accident, though her body was never recovered. The days that followed were heavy, like the town itself was mourning. Snow began to fall in thick, silent sheets, muffling the streets and cloaking everything in white. I remember seeing Helen's young daughter, Abby, standing in her front yard, looking up at the sky as the snow drifted down, her tiny form dwarfed by the emptiness left in her mother's wake. But things took a darker turn when another resident disappeared, Tom Grant, a retired teacher. He had a habit of taking long evening walks, often strolling down the same river path where Helen's truck had been found. Tom was known for his easygoing nature, a friendly guy who loved to talk about his travels and his plans to see more of the world. But on December 15th, just 5 days after Helen, he went out for his evening walk and never came back. Panic began to seep into the town. The local paper printed stories speculating about what might be happening, some of them bordering on hysteria. Theories about a rogue animal prowling the woods, or rumors of a mysterious stranger seen near the river, spread like wildfire. But there was little the police could do beyond sending out search parties that came back empty-handed. We were a small town and our resources were limited. I tried to keep calm for Maddie's sake, assuring her that everything was fine, that the people disappearing were just coincidences, and that it had nothing to do with our family. But my assurances felt hollow, and as each night passed, I found myself checking the locks on the doors and windows more and more often. Claire, too, was tense, though she put on a brave face for Maddie, never letting our daughter see the worry etched in her eyes. Days turned into weeks, and it seemed the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for whatever terrible thing was happening to pass. But then, just when we thought it was over, a third person vanished. Sarah Reed, a teenager who lived down the street. She'd been babysitting for the Martin family that night and left their house around 9 p.m., bundled up against the cold. But she never made it home. Her parents reported her missing early the next morning, and the search party found her scarf tangled in the branches of a bush near the river. The town was paralyzed with fear. People stopped going out at night, parents kept their children close, and even the once friendly atmosphere turned suspicious. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every unfamiliar face was met with distrust. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, listening for any sound that didn't belong, any sign that someone, or something, was lurking outside our house. The only person who seemed untouched by the fear was old Ben Delaney, the town's unofficial historian. Ben had lived in Fallow Pines his entire life and knew more about its past than anyone else. He was often seen wandering the town's wooded trails, notebook in hand, muttering to himself about the things he'd seen or heard. Ben had a reputation for being eccentric, even a little strange, but he was harmless. I figured if anyone knew what was going on, it would be him. One afternoon, after a fresh snowfall had blanketed the town, I found Ben sitting on a bench outside the old general store, wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf. He looked up as I approached, his eyes bright and curious. "David," he greeted me with a nod. "How's the family?" "We're all right," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "Listen, Ben, do you know what's been going on? These disappearances, they're scaring people. I thought you might know if something like this has happened before." Ben's face grew somber, and he glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "Not for a long time," he said quietly. "Not since the winter of '65. I frowned. "What happened in '65? He let out a long, slow breath, his gaze drifting to the snow-covered trees. "It was a bad winter, worse than this one. 3 people vanished that year too, all of them by the river. They searched for days but never found a trace, not a single clue. People talked about all sorts of things, wild animals, a drifter passing through, but no one ever figured it out. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No one else disappeared after that, and eventually people moved on." I felt a chill creep down my spine. Do you think it's the same thing happening now?" Ben shrugged, his eyes distant. "I don't know, David, but I'll tell you this. The river's been here long before any of us. It's seen things we can't even imagine. Sometimes I think it has a way of calling people." I didn't know what to say to that. It sounded like nonsense, but there was something unsettling in Ben's voice, something that made me feel like he believed every word he was saying. I thanked him and headed home, his words echoing in my mind. That night, as the wind howled outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the woods, something watching and waiting. I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the house, until I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud, sharp sound from outside. I shot out of bed, my heart pounding. Claire stirred beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered. I shook my head, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. "Stay here, I'll check." I crept down the stairs, every step feeling like it took an eternity. The house was deathly quiet, and as I reached the front door, I took a deep breath, steeling myself before opening it. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I squinted into the darkness, shining the flashlight across the yard. The snow was undisturbed, the world eerily silent. But then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A single set of footprints leading from the edge of the woods to our porch, and then nothing. They stopped right in front of the door, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. My blood ran cold. I slammed the door shut, bolting it and locking every window I could find. Whatever was out there, I didn't want it coming any closer to my family. The next few days passed in a tense silence. I barely slept, and I could tell Claire was just as on edge as I was. We kept Maddie close, never letting her out of our sight. The disappearances had stopped for now, but the unease lingered, a constant weight pressing down on us. And then, one evening, as I was coming back from town, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Just ahead of me, at the edge of the river, was a figure, standing perfectly still. It was wearing a long coat, its face obscured by shadow. But as I watched, it slowly turned, and I caught a glimpse of its face. Pale, expressionless, and so familiar it took my breath away. It was Helen McCarthy. Or at least it looked like her. I had been renting a small cabin on Ashwood Lake for about a year when everything began to change. I'd moved there after a particularly messy divorce, eager to leave the city and find somewhere quiet, somewhere that would let me get my bearings again. The lake was remote, peaceful, and seemed like the perfect place to start over. Little did I know, it would soon turn into the most unnerving experience of my life. It was late September, and the first hints of autumn had begun to color the trees surrounding the lake. I spent most of my days either fishing or reading on the back deck, occasionally chatting with the other residents who lived around Ashwood. We were a small community, only a handful of us scattered around the lake, mostly retirees and a few weekenders. Felt safe, almost idyllic. Then, one evening, I noticed a new light across the water. It wasn't there before, at least not that I'd noticed. The other cabins were fairly spaced out, but I knew the area well enough to recognize that there shouldn't have been any light in that part of the woods. Curiosity got the best of me, so I grabbed my binoculars and aimed them across the water. Through the thickening dusk, I could just make out the faint outline of a structure, maybe a cabin partially hidden behind a wall of trees. I'd never seen it before, and for good reason. There wasn't supposed to be anything on that side of the lake. It was private land, and rumor had it that the owner didn't take kindly to trespassers. I shrugged it off, figuring that someone must have been out there, maybe camping or doing some night fishing. The thought was strange, but not alarming. A few days later, as I was heading back from town with groceries, I noticed something odd by the side of the road that led up to the lake. A battered old pickup truck, parked at an awkward angle, half hidden in the bushes. The truck was covered in mud, its paint chipped and faded, like it hadn't been driven in years. As I passed by, I noticed someone sitting inside, a figure hunched over the wheel. I slowed down, but didn't stop, thinking that if they were in trouble, they'd wave me down. They didn't, so I kept going, feeling a strange unease settle in the pit of my stomach. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of that truck. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. I tossed and turned, trying to fall asleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark shape of the figure behind the wheel. Eventually, sleep found me, but it wasn't restful. I woke up around 2 a.m., drenched in sweat and feeling disoriented. I fumbled for the light, but just as I turned it on, I heard a faint sound outside, a rustling, like someone or something moving through the trees. My cabin was fairly isolated, so it wasn't uncommon to hear wildlife at night, but this sound was different, deliberate. I stayed still, holding my breath, straining to hear. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped and silence settled over the lake once more. The next morning, I went outside to check for any signs of movement, maybe animal tracks or something that could explain the sound. To my surprise, I found boot prints in the mud just outside my back door. They were large, too large to be mine, and fresh enough to have been made in the last few hours. My pulse quickened as I scanned the yard, half expecting to see someone watching me from the tree line. But I was alone, or so it seemed. I tried to shrug it off, chalking it up to a random hiker or camper who'd gotten too close to my property. But as the days wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I began noticing small things out of place. A chair on the deck moved, a half-empty coffee mug I didn't remember leaving outside, a strange smell, like mildew and something rotting, drifting through the open windows at odd hours. Every time I convinced myself it was my imagination, something else would happen, nudging that quiet dread just a little bit closer. One night, just as I was settling down with a book, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and checked the circuit breaker, but everything seemed fine. It wasn't unusual for us to lose power during storms, but that night, the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. As I stood there, wondering what to do, I caught a flicker of light across the lake. The same light I'd seen a few nights before. Only this time, it was moving, bobbing up and down as if someone were walking along the shore. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. That light shouldn't have been there, not in the middle of the night. Without really thinking, I found myself heading outside, slipping quietly along the trail that wound down to the shore. The flashlight shook in my hands as I walked, the beam barely penetrating the inky darkness. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was probably just someone with a lantern or flashlight, maybe a night fisherman or someone camping illegally. But deep down, I knew better. I reached the shore and stopped, squinting across the water. The light was still there, faint and distant, but unmistakable. And then, as I watched, it blinked out, leaving me standing alone in the silence. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the place where the light had been. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed it whole, leaving nothing but an empty, echoing void. Eventually, I turned and stumbled back to the cabin, locking every door and window behind me. The next morning, I called the police, feeling embarrassed but too unsettled to care. An officer arrived an hour later, a middle-aged man named Carson who'd been working the area for years. I explained what I'd seen and showed him the boot prints outside, which were still faintly visible in the dirt. Carson listened patiently, nodding as he scribbled notes in his notepad. When I finished, he looked up, a concerned expression on his face. "You're not the first to report something strange out here," he said, glancing out the window toward the lake. "A few people around here have been seeing lights in the woods, hearing strange noises at night. We haven't been able to find anything, but I'd be careful if I were you." He left me with a polite warning to call if I noticed anything else unusual, and with that, he was gone, leaving me alone once more. The days passed slowly after that. The lights returned every night, each time in a different spot, each time staying just long enough to keep me on edge. I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself it was just campers or maybe pranksters trying to scare the locals. But deep down, I knew something was out there, something that didn't belong. Then, one night, as I was locking up, I heard a faint tapping sound at the front door. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood frozen, listening as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I took a deep breath and opened the door a crack, peering out into the darkness. There was no one there. Just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something lying on the doorstep. A small, weathered notebook, its cover frayed and pages yellowed with age. I picked it up and brought it inside, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. The entries were brief, written in a shaky hand. They described strange lights, noises in the night, the feeling of being watched. As I read, a sense of dread washed over me. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. "They're getting closer. Every night they come a little closer. I don't know who or what they are, but I can feel them watching, waiting. I fear it won't be long now." That was the last entry. There was no name, no date, nothing to identify who had written it. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the door, flashlight in hand, watching and waiting. Days passed, but I never saw the lights again, and the notebook remained a grim reminder of the nights I'd spent haunted by their presence. The feeling of being watched faded over time, but I never quite shook the unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Eventually, I left Ashwood Lake, but even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the dead of night, half expecting to see a flicker of light in the distance, or hear a faint, persistent tapping at the door. Whatever had been out there, I hope it stayed in those woods, far from the light of day, because some mysteries, I've learned, are best left unsolved. It was a stretch of rural road, cutting through thick woods on either side, where nothing but deer and the occasional lost dog wandered through. Locals knew to avoid it after dark, as they did with most roads around here. But the residents of the small town of Ridgeway had particular reasons to steer clear of Raven Road at night, and as I'd find out, those reasons went beyond mere superstition. The road had been there since the 1800s, originally built as a path for horse-drawn carriages. Over time, it expanded to a two-lane road, but for the most part, it remained neglected and overgrown. Still, it was the fastest way home for me after late shifts at the restaurant. So I ignored the warnings, told myself not to listen to old wives' tales, and took it every time I needed to get back quickly. What I didn't know was that those tales would become very real for me, in ways I still find hard to believe. It was a Friday night, and I'd finished cleaning up later than usual. The kitchen staff had left hours before, so I was the last one out, locking up and turning off the lights. As I climbed into my car, I noticed how silent the town was. Most of the shops and houses were dark, save for a few porch lights scattered along the main street. I was already exhausted, so I decided to take Raven Road again, thinking nothing of it. About 5 minutes in, I saw a flicker out of the corner of my eye. It looked like headlights reflecting off something in the trees. I glanced in my rearview mirror but saw nothing. Figuring it was just a trick of the mind or some wandering animal, I kept driving. The road stretched out before me, twisting and turning through the dense woods, the only sound the soft hum of my engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. I was about halfway down the road when the lights returned, this time much closer, brighter. My pulse quickened as I glanced back, expecting to see a car tailing me. But again, the road was empty. Only darkness stretched behind, with no sign of any vehicle. I shook it off, telling myself it was my imagination, and focused on the road. But the lights continued to flicker, coming from every direction, illuminating patches of the trees, darting between them as if something were moving through the woods at an impossible speed. I was getting anxious now, gripping the wheel tightly, eyes darting to my mirrors every few seconds. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was tall, thin, with limbs too long and slightly crooked, almost as if it had been put together wrong. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt mere feet from where the figure stood. My headlights washed over it, but all I could see was a silhouette, dark and featureless. For a moment, we both remained still, me in my car, the figure in the road, illuminated by my headlights. I couldn't make out a face, but I had the unsettling sense that it was staring directly at me. My heart pounded as I struggled to think, to do anything. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. I don't know what came over me, but a surge of adrenaline kicked in. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I sped backward. My eyes stayed glued to the figure, which hadn't moved since that single step forward, but the closer I got to the bend, the less clear it became, fading into the shadows until it was gone. The relief was temporary, though. The moment I rounded the bend, I saw them. The lights, bright and erratic, filling the woods on either side, zigzagging between the trees, moving fast enough that I couldn't make out their source. The lights were getting closer, converging on the road, until they were mere feet away from my car. I had no choice but to keep driving, speeding down Raven Road, even though every instinct told me to turn around. The lights followed me, relentless, never dimming or slowing, as if they were herding me forward. Eventually, I saw the end of the road, where it met the main highway, and the lights stopped. They didn't fade or disappear, but rather, they simply hovered at the edge of the trees, watching as I pulled onto the highway, heart racing, hands shaking. When I looked back, they were gone, as if they'd never been there at all. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But every time I thought about taking that road again, a chill ran down my spine. Still, life went on, and eventually, I found myself in a situation where I had no choice but to take Raven Road again. This time, I was prepared. I told myself that I wouldn't stop, no matter what I saw, no matter what lights appeared. I was about 10 minutes in when the lights began flickering again, appearing on either side of the road, darting through the trees like fireflies. I gripped the wheel and kept my eyes forward, refusing to look, to acknowledge them. But then I saw her, a woman standing in the middle of the road, dressed in a torn, mud-stained dress, her hair wild and matted. She looked directly at me, her eyes wide and pleading, one hand raised as if to stop me. Everything in me wanted to hit the brakes, to help her, but my gut told me that something was wrong. Her mouth moved, and though I couldn't hear her, I felt as if she were screaming, begging me to stop. I closed my eyes, praying for her to disappear, and when I opened them, she was gone. But her image stayed with me, etched into my mind, as if I'd seen her in a nightmare. I sped up, desperate to get off Raven Road, and soon the lights began flickering again, closer and brighter than before, surrounding me on all sides. Just as I thought they would swallow me, the lights stopped. I was back at the end of the road, back on the main highway, heart racing, knuckles white from gripping the wheel. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the lights or the woman, but there was nothing. Only the quiet, empty road stretching behind me. After that, I vowed never to take Raven Road again, no matter what. But the memories haunted me, the lights and the figures, the woman's pleading eyes. I started asking around town, trying to find anyone who'd seen what I had, anyone who could explain it. But no one had answers. They only had stories, old legends about Raven Road, tales of people who had vanished without a trace, sightings of strange lights and figures. Years have passed since then, and I've moved away from Ridgeway, hoping to leave those memories behind. But every now and then, I'll catch a flicker of light in my peripheral vision or hear a faint whisper in the wind, and I remember the woman's face, her silent scream, the feeling of being watched. Some nights, I wonder what might have happened if I'd stopped, if I'd ignored my instincts and gotten out of the car. Part of me thinks I would have found nothing but an empty road, a trick of the light. But another part of me knows better. Whatever lurks on Raven Road, it doesn't want to be seen, and it doesn't let go easily. So, if you ever find yourself in Ridgeway and someone warns you about Raven Road, listen, because some roads lead nowhere, and some roads lead to places we were never meant to go.